Okay, welcome to the Climate Commission podcast, Climate Chats with Students. I'm your host, Sonya, and I am the Climate Commission Officer for the Climate Commission for UK Higher and Further Education Students and Leaders. And the Climate Commission is a partnership between Association of Colleges, EAUC, the Alliance for Sustainability, Leadership and Education, Guild HE, and Universities UK. And this partnership is working to coordinate climate action in the sector to produce a clear, cohesive, and consistent response to the climate emergency by the end of the year. And students are at the heart of our work, and we're going to be talking to students throughout the podcast. So enjoy. I'm really excited because today is the first podcast in our series, and the podcast's aim is to highlight the voices of students. So we have lots of students interested in and involved in the Commission, and they're from all sorts of disciplines and backgrounds. And we want to learn more about these students and how these disciplines and how these backgrounds have influenced their decisions to take climate action and their journeys towards sustainability in their personal lives, but also for their institutions. And so we want to learn more about the students on the Commission, their next steps, what are your plans for the future. And we want to do this to honor students, as students really are the driving force behind climate action globally and in the sector, but also to share student experiences with institutional leaders and others in the sector. I'm really delighted to be joined by student climate commissioner Manveer Gill, who's in his fourth year. He's a fourth year mathematics student at the University of Warwick. So thank you for being our first guest, Manveer.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm
glad,
honoured to be the first one.
Yeah, the first ever, and so it's really quite brave. So I guess I just want to start off with your discipline, so mathematics. So why did you decide to study mathematics at Warwick? Was this something that you were always interested in, or did you find it later on as you grew older?
I used to love maths at school, and I think in part that's because it came naturally to me. Mm-hmm. And so I was just quite good at it. And I think I really enjoyed that feeling of being good at something. I was one of those people who actually enjoyed maths exams because I liked being tested. Quite weird, I know. But then I think I found that when I came to university, that style of maths changed dramatically. And as a result, I just wasn't as good at it. And I think a lot of people who come to university and study maths find that there is a significant learning curve. Mm-hmm. And so now I find myself liking some parts of maths more than others. And I think because I'm also quite interested in areas outside, typically outside of maths, my interest in maths has certainly waned compared to my former years. For me, I would say I kind of became more interested in, particularly in, say, differential equations and fluid dynamics, which I'm not sure how much that means to you.
Not much.
But I mean, the latter especially is just what it sounds like. It's about learning about the dynamics of how fluid motion works. And I found things like that quite interesting. I think particularly because I was aware of the applications of that to, say, climate science and the weather.
Brilliant, yeah.
So I think knowing what the application was made it far more interesting to me. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that's the same for all mathematicians, but yeah.
That's really interesting. And that like segues perfectly into my second question, which is, you know, why and how did you become interested in the climate crisis? And we'll talk about this later, but is mathematics at all involved in that passion of yours?
Well, I'd always known that climate change was an issue. I think most people do. But the extent of it wasn't really known to me until my second year of university. So I really wanted to branch out at that point. I was kind of at a bit of a lull with the maths, and I was a bit bored of it, if I'm being honest. And so I found this optional module called Challenges of Climate Change. And that was from a different department that focuses on interdisciplinary learning. And so right from the beginning, I think I just found myself gripped by what I was reading, you know, the scale of the challenge in front of us and the systemic lack of action. I think that really does draw an emotional response out of a lot of people once they find out about kind of the details of what's going on with the climate crisis. And I was no different. So I kept reading to inform myself. I was taking part in like several optional modules around the themes of sustainable development and climate change. And then on my year abroad, also environmental economics. And I think that has really, it's provided me with a foundation of learning for around this topic. And also just, I think by discussing these things with other students and with academics, it's been a nice introduction to the climate crisis. And as I said, I was immediately hooked. So
wow. And so what was the initial thought process behind taking the first module? Because I know you were tired of just math focused classes, but you could have taken anything. You could have taken French, I mean, I assume so at least.
yeah, we could have.
Yeah.
And that would have been more perhaps typical, because I'd already studied some French at school, for
Right.
example.
Right.
And there were so many optional modules that I could have taken. So it's a good question. And I wouldn't be able to give you an answer that I think was so precise. I think I remember reading the module description and thinking, hey, this sounds important. This sounds cool. I want to learn more about it. And that was literally all it was. And that was enough.
And was that open to, so were you in a class with other math students, or was it you kind of immersed in the world of sustainability by yourself?
So that particular module was actually neither of those. So it was a mixture of students, because it was an interdisciplinary department. It's the Institute for Advanced Teaching and Learning. They provide modules on kind of a plethora of topics, from stuff like challenges of climate change, something called the science of music. You can find pretty much anything there. I say anything, anything's a lot. And yeah, I think we found that in those, so we had seminars and we had lectures, and in those seminars there were a real mix of students from different departments. So there were students from English, French, sustainable development, politics and international studies, pretty much across the board. And I was one of two mathematicians. So it was a really nice mix, and I really enjoyed the process of learning alongside and talking to these people who have studied in their own disciplines and in their own ways. And it kind of makes you come out of your shell, your mathematical shell anyway. And yeah, that was quite cool.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. So you found this one course, and that sort of instilled in you this desire to learn more. And now you're you're on the Climate Commission, you're a student commissioner. And I was wondering, how did you decide to join the commission, and how did you decide this was the right thing, the right way for you to take climate action?
Okay, so I mean, through all of that studying, it was clear to me that I wanted my career to be around the climate crisis.
Right.
And so whenever possible, I tried to get any experience I could in any way. If it related to the climate crisis, I wanted to be involved with it. And so I was part of a social enterprise called Food Intercept, which is part of Enactus Warwick.
Right.
So that's the Warwick branch of Enactus UK. And that's a kind of a big social action and social enterprise organization based in the UK, and they have university branches, and they had a monthly mail that went around, and I think some part of that mentioned that there was this opportunity of being involved with the Climate Commission. And immediately I saw that and I thought, yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing I want to be a part of, because the learning experience of working on quite a high level project alongside people with a wealth of experience and knowledge, and I think a mission that I feel quite strongly about. I come from the sector of education. It's really the only thing I've ever known. And I can really see the importance of having a cohesive action across the sector and making sure that everyone is moving towards the same goal. So I think those are all things that brought me towards the commission. Initially as a council member. So the initial opportunity was to become a member of the council, and then later on, I got to be a member of the commission.
Yeah.
And however, I didn't actually think that I'd get in, if I'm being honest. I saw the email and I thought, I don't really have the experience for this.
Right.
But in spite of that, I think that I became quite accustomed to working with everyone when I joined. And so I think that goes to show, that when an opportunity presents itself, you should just go for it and just see what happens.
I'd say that, a lot of times it's about experience, but it's also about how much you care and how much you're willing to, learn and contribute. And I think the students on the commission are so incredible in terms of that, and of course lots of experience. But I think it's interesting, the idea that you say you came from education, so that was what you knew, and so you wanted to work on climate action in the sector essentially. I just think it's really interesting when students want to specifically choose to propel climate action in the sector. Does that make sense? Because I feel like there's so many different areas that we can work in.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, so I do think that's quite interesting.
Definitely.
So you did mention that you decided that you wanted a career in working in the climate crisis, and I was just wondering what, because to me, I just think the climate crisis is such a massive issue, and a career working in the climate crisis just spans all sorts of disciplines, spans all sorts of sectors. And I want to know what that means for you, a career working in climate crisis. What does that mean?
Well, actually, I remember trying to reconcile this right at the beginning of my interest, trying to think, being a mathematician, all I'd really considered at that point was very maths-oriented careers. And I then had to think about, well, what's the best way of going about this? And so traditionally, I thought perhaps academia would be quite a cool way in. And in terms of the math side, that involves, say, the physical side of climate change, the physical basis for climate change, and kind of more weather-related, climate-related phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
But then I was particularly interested in the policy side, the governance side of things. And I remember thinking, I want to do both. I want to do both simultaneously. I want to be working in governance and I want to be working on the physical basis. But having talked to some people that have done both, it's like normally transitioned from one to the other, usually transitioning from working on climate, the physical basis, and then moving towards governance. The consensus that I got was it's quite difficult to be working on those two things simultaneously. When you give something your all, it takes a lot of time, and it's quite difficult to give two really important, quite big tasks all of your effort. So I think I struggled with this for a while, and I think I struggled to decide what I'm really interested in and what I'm passionate about, because I think there's so many areas within the climate crisis, across things related to sustainability, that I think, I'd love to get involved with that. And with that in mind, I think I don't know if I have an exact definition of what my career will look like for now. I know that I'm really interested currently in sustainable finance because of the power of the sector of finance and the need for finance into projects that are sustainable. And I mean, not just into sustainable projects, but ensuring that all projects that are being financed are sustainable. And so how we can go about doing that is something that currently really interests me. So, I mean, that relates to the role that I will have at CDP. So, yeah.
Wow, that's brilliant. I think it's fascinating, this technical side versus the social side that you're simultaneously interested in. And so I was wondering how you reconcile with both worlds. You were saying they're two massive areas. Yeah, because the social side of sustainable finance, but also just the math behind it. Do you find that interesting? Like, is it ever overwhelming? What do you do about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is something that, in governments, this is something that they struggle to deal with. Scientists coming with recommendations and ideas, and perhaps at times struggling to communicate those ideas to social scientists. And I guess also vice versa, saying, hey, we've got these considerations, and perhaps those are not so easy to quantify,
Yeah.
And so I think the solution to this has to be more communication and teaching people how to communicate what they do to a more general audience. So I think that, in fact, I'll probably talk about this a little bit later, but when it comes to interdisciplinary learning, we don't necessarily always see that in all degrees. We don't see that as a necessity. We see a lot of silo-based thinking, and I think that's much to the detriment of trying to find solutions, to all the problems that we see. But at the same time, I think to an extent they do need to be separate, because at the end of the day, the maths that will occur needs to happen in quite a technical way, for example, and again, all the social science that goes into producing, say, whatever a social scientist is producing. Wish I had something better for you there. Will undoubtedly require, again, that technical knowledge in their own field. And so and it's about that kind of middle communication. That's where we need to see the links, I think.
Yeah, we need more people like you who can do both in one.
I
In
mean,
one.
I'm not too sure if I can do both. I definitely would like to get there, and
Yeah,
I think I've got the ability to do both. I think most people do, but it'll take time for me to be able to think about those kind of things and to learn. I think the more you learn, the better you become.
that's an incredibly humble response. It's really interesting, and I was just wondering about how your degree, so you mentioned a few examples, but how does your interest in, if you could just expand essentially on how your interest with the climate crisis interacts with your degree. And so you did mention weather and um, uh, finance and whatnot, but if you could expand on that, that'd be great.
So, I mean, in terms of my degree, there's definitely some interaction, but most of it's indirect. So, in first year modules explore a lot of different areas, and they provide a foundation upon which to build in each of those areas. And so as a result, there's quite a limited application of learning, which isn't usually climate related. In fact, it's usually very, specific to those modules and to that learning experience. Um, but as a result of having that foundation, and as you go further down the line, there's definitely more opportunities to engage with climate change. And that could be perhaps through independent research. There's some opportunities at Warwick, and I'm sure at other universities, where you can conduct your own research. Modules from other departments, which Warwick is particularly good for because the maths degree is very flexible. Like in my final year, I only had to take around half of my modules as maths modules, and the rest could be from other departments within reason. And yeah, I think that's pretty useful. And there's obviously just all the different areas of maths that relate to different issues around climate change. So perhaps that could be stuff like dynamical systems and chaos theory, and trying to understand what is going on and what's going to happen, trying to predict things, trying to model different aspects, say of weather, of anything really. And I think there's just so many broad applications of mathematical knowledge that I think anyone who has not just the technical awareness of that area of math, say, but also then the interest in, say, the climate crisis, could easily begin to explore how they can approach some aspect of the climate crisis. And it might not seem so direct, but it could be something like, we think of carbon capture and storage. We might be wanting to create some kind of mechanism that can scrub the air and provide a solution to us in that respect. Well, undoubtedly, all that kind of modeling that goes into that will be driven by mathematics. So I think that's one example of where you can really start to use your knowledge in a way that only you and other people with that knowledge can.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think a lot of those areas of maths are fundamental to understanding the physical basis for climate change. But getting to that point does require a deep understanding of a topic. And that comes from first studying it outside of that context. And so that's why there can be quite a limited interaction at the beginning of your degree. But there's certainly the scope for interaction if someone does have that interest.
So how would you like to see mathematics classes in the further and higher education sector develop to fully consider the climate crisis and to embed sustainability and to prepare graduates for a changing world, essentially?
So, I mean, firstly, this is quite a difficult task. The associations that accredit maths degrees usually require that certain things are taught in order for the degree to be valid.
Right.
And particularly in earlier years, there's so much content to cram in that there's not much room for additional modules that focus on these things. So if I wanted to see a shift, I'd want to see it come through that accreditation requirement
Right.
to shift to reflect that global need. the need to have graduates that understand sustainability and understand climate change. I think having that awareness and understanding throughout their degree would make those graduates much more inclined and capable to then apply those in ways that we need to see.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the easiest way to do that could be to have an additional module on courses that is compulsory and it teaches them about sustainability and the climate crisis. Perhaps a module that's themed around global challenges, perhaps, for example.
To me, climate change and the climate crisis is entirely like an ethical dilemma. And no disciplines really teach ethics, which I find really interesting. So like in STEM and in social sciences sometimes too, we don't really understand the morality behind things. And I find that that could be really important in pushing climate action.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you'd agree with that in terms
I mean, definitely. I think that, as I said, that emotional reaction that was drawn out of me was from reading about the impact that this is going to have. And you talk about morality and say climate justice, just the fact that geographically there's a lot of injustice with climate change as well as intergenerationally. And if you're not aware of those things, I think you're also less drawn to it, you know. So I think if you give people an understanding of these things, then they're in a much more informed place to decide whether they want to, you know, explore this area in more detail. And I mean, you could say that about anything, but I'm particularly inclined to say that sustainability and the climate crisis, well, those things require that we need our graduates to be thinking about these things. Ultimately, what we need more of is interdisciplinary learning, because coming up with sustainable solutions, it does require mathematicians, but it also requires economists, sociologists, historians, and that's just to name a few. Without that compulsory interdisciplinary learning, I think we produce graduates who might be inclined to think in the silo of their discipline, and those that might then struggle to communicate with people from other disciplines when it's needed. So, I mean, we see this issue throughout academia, and I think that the future of learning has to be a more interdisciplinary approach. So I think that's a big part of the solution for me.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Every single good education experience I've had has been interdisciplinary and learning with other people who are not in my field. And yeah, completely agree. And that's well-rounded understanding of the sustainability, the economic, the social, the actual environmental issues. This might be difficult, and I didn't write this down to ask you beforehand, but where do you see yourself in 10 years, 10, 15 years, career-wise, but also in your personal journey with the climate crisis?
Okay, well, I think that there's definitely several areas of interest for me at the moment. As I've said, sustainable finance. I'd quite like to see myself in this sector for at least a few years. I'd quite like to be in a managerial role, something higher up. That's quite what interests me. And I do think that I'm just going to have to see how my journey develops, because I find that my interests sort of shift and develop quite regularly on a several month type scale. So, you know, if you ask me what's going to be happening in 10 years, chances are I'll look back and think, yeah, he had no idea that he's going to be doing this. But one thing I would definitely like to still be doing, which I've just started, is so me and a friend, Todd Olive, we've started up the Down to Earth Institute. We've not quite launched yet. We'll be launching on August the 14th.
Brilliant.
And our aim is to our aim is to make sustainability accessible to everybody. And so we're going to do this by trying to explain sustainability concepts and challenges in a way that is accessible to everyone, and try and become a hub for knowledge on sustainability and develops in the area. And as a part of actually creating this and making this happen, I'm going to be learning so much about all the different facets of sustainability, because we're going to be writing and researching all of these things. And I think also a lot of people like to think of sustainability as the environmental crisis, but there's actually a social and economic side of that I think a lot of people just kind of forget about, or don't pay enough attention to. And so I'd quite like to change that perception. I'd quite like to change that perception across the world, but you know, actually having some kind of global impact is quite difficult, and that will take time. So
Yeah.
if in 10 years time I'm still working on this project, then certainly that will mean that we've had some amount of success, and I'd really love to think that that could be the case.
Wow, that's amazing. Was it like an experience that inspired you to create Down to Earth? Did you find that you were talking to people that didn't think that sustainability was accessible? Like, what sort of, drove this idea?
Yeah, so I think partly you always hear people talking about sustainability and they immediately think the environment. That's the first thing people think. And
Right.
I think just out of that association, you begin to see perhaps the lack of understanding from people. And that's not necessarily their fault. It's the way it's kind of been presented to them until now.
Mm.
And I'd quite like sustainability. I think sustainability is kind of a niche field still. It's still something that is a bit specialist. And I think everyone needs to know about it. So I think just personally, that's the way I feel. But also, Todd and I like to have a lot of conversations about what we'd like to do and what we think needs to happen in the world. And I think enough of those conversations eventually lead you to thinking, well, why don't we actually do something ourselves? So
Yeah,
yeah,
that's really cool. I'm excited to see it and to keep up to date with it.
great. And yeah, August the 14th. So I'll definitely be, going down all the social media channels and
Okay, so I'll just see you.
making sure that, yeah, you'll definitely see it. And if you don't, then I've done something wrong.
But thank you so much, Manveer, for chatting with me today about your journey in sustainability. And thank you so much for all you do for the Commission. It really is just so incredible and meaningful.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm glad to be a part of it. I think I've learned as much as I think I might have given. So I've really enjoyed the process. And well, we're not done just yet. There's still the second half of the year to go. So
Yeah, we'll keep pushing.
yeah.